Hello and welcome to Dialogue. In a speech to political leaders and business elites at the 2025 Davos World Economic Forum, U.S. President Donald Trump accused the European Union of treating his country, in his words, very unfairly and very badly. He added that he would no longer accept the U.S. trade deficit with the 27-nation bloc. Before that, Trump also spoke of imposing tariffs on imports from Mexico, Canada, and China. Along with the new tariffs, Trump is expected to make policy changes in the areas of immigration, defense, and energy. And what's the likely impact of Trump's policies on the rest of the world? And what has been the international reaction so far to his comments and decisions? And what kind of a world are we in for during the next 4 years and beyond? Join us for our discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Daniel Gross, Director of the Institute for European Policymaking of Bocconi University, and Susana Munoz, Managing Partner of GBA Latam Trade and Investment Advisors, and Carl Fay, Professor of Strategy at BI Norwegian Business School, and he's also an affiliated scholar of Bloc Forum. Welcome to the show. So, Daniel, I will start with you. Trump just made a speech not long ago at the World Economic Forum, of course, at Davos. He talked about the mostly relationship at one point with the European Union, very unfairly, very badly. That was his words to describe his country being treated by the European Union. Of course, he's talking about a trade deficit, things like that. What's your response to that kind of remarks?
Well, Trump has long been very critical of the EU to run such a large trade surplus with the US. Actually, on his campaign website, one also finds specific accusations that the EU has tariffs against the US, but these are small, 5–10%. And I think if that were the problem, the EU could easily negotiate a deal with Trump. But I think ultimately the problem will not so much be trade, but it will much more the regulatory treatment of the big American software and internet companies, because that is where there are some very strong interests of, for example, Elon Musk and others in the US administration, and that might be much more difficult to solve.
Well, you mentioned that. That's interesting. He did talked about Facebook, Google, Apple. Some of them, were fined by the European regulators. They talk about, heavy regulation. He's not happy with that. Billions of dollars being fined. Is there any kind of a possible compromise between the two sides that can be made?
Yes, I think the compromise will unfortunately be that the Europeans will have to take back some of the fines or be a bit softer, because ultimately they still depend on the US security guarantees. And in particular, for Europe, what is decisive is that the US continues to support Ukraine in its war against Russia.
Could it be basically, kind of a trade between the two sides on different items? So, Carl, I want to have you to talk about, for those who are not familiar with international trade. For most of the people will say, you export what you can to make a profit, to make money, and you import, stuff you think that you can make money, you can sell to your domestic consumers. And for the consumers, you buy what you need. That's free and fair. Is that the case?
Well, sort of, but I think it's a little more complicated than the picture you paint. Of course, a lot of countries can produce similar things. And the question is, where should you produce different things? And the world is all better off if different countries specialize in what they're best suited to do due to labor costs, due to natural resources, etc. So there is not a best industry to focus in for every country. There's a best industry for a particular country, and this is what Trump is forgetting. Of course, Trump's idea of placing high tariffs on imported goods to protect American jobs is attractive to the average American who says, okay, now I'm likely to keep my job and we will have more jobs in the US. But this is short-sighted. Occasionally in the short term, this can have some benefits, but in the long term, it will not. As a matter of fact, there have been a number of interesting studies recently that have predicted that there will be a decrease in U.S. GDP by about 1.75 to 3.45% if the different types of scenarios that Trump is suggesting will come into play. And probably inflation could go up by maybe 2 to 4%, and probably there could be a decrease in employment by maybe about almost 1%. So it's really risky to move down the line of putting tariffs in place.
We'll look, take a deeper look at those issues. But before that, let's, shift to, of course, this country closer to the U.S., Mexico and Canada. So we have Susanna, originally from Mexico. Of course, Donald Trump talked about, 25% tariff on imports from Mexico. So what's the response? Of course, people would not be happy, but how people see that kind of action?
Well, thank you. Good evening. So thank you. Well, the reality is that Mexico is the main trade partner with the U.S. In 2023, we traded around 807 billion US dollars, which is larger. This sum is larger than Canada and China. So Mexico is also a great source of foreign crude to the U.S. and also a source of many imports such as vehicle parts, semiconductors, and other electronic components. So raising tariffs on Mexican products will not only result in an increased prices for imports for the U.S. manufacturing sector, but will also increase the prices for many agricultural products that are purchased by the average American citizen. So causing, therefore, inflation in many consumer goods and other daily necessities. The second issue is that the Mexican president, Dr. Sheinbaum, has already announced that Mexico will retaliate if the U.S. imposes these tariffs on the Mexican products. So this will be like a tit-for-tat scenario, which will be really disastrous for Mexican and the U.S. economy, because Mexican consumers will also suffer from these tariffs raised to the U.S. imports, and of course, the American exporters will also be affected by these tariffs. We have done this before. In fact, 2018, U.S. raised tariffs on aluminum and steel imports from Mexico, and within a matter of a few weeks, the Mexican government raised tariff in other American products. So, of course, several U.S. industries complained, and then they resulted in the U.S. adjusting this tariff. So the reality is that the NAFTA agreement, which now the USMCA, was created with the aim of really strengthening the region, the North American region, and making a really competitive economy. However, raising the tariffs will, of course, violate the terms of the USMCA agreement, and of course will definitely just destroy the competitivity of the regional economy.
Daniel, so let's say, Mexico is ready. If there's tariff, they will fight back, retaliatory measures with more tariffs probably on the U.S. products. So in the case of the absence of a trade deal between the EU and the U.S., so is EU ready to impose probably, to take retaliatory measures against the U.S. products?
There are some that are ready. Mostly the policymakers in Brussels. They want to show that the EU is strong, but the policymakers at the national level are much more cautious. They have their own export industries to protect, and they don't want to antagonize the US because we still depend on the security guarantee. So the Commission will probably talk tough, the European Commission that is, and member states will say, but please go slowly. And since in the end, member states have to approve everything the European Commission does, I think the response from the EU will be quite muted.
Quite muted. And Carl, what about Canada? Of course, possible tariffs on products from Canada, imports from Canada. And of course, the Canadian government has talked about, basically strong measures against the U.S. side. Do you see that kind of a scenario, a tit-for-tat situation?
Maybe.
I do think Canada will probably react and take some retaliatory tariffs if the U.S. imposes tariffs, as looks likely to happen. But I would like to point out, when dealing with the Trump administration, there is one silver lining, good thing, and that is that Trump likes to negotiate. And so some of this is a ploy, perhaps, to try to get countries to negotiate. Trump wants to decrease illegal immigrants flowing in through Mexico and fentanyl, and also fentanyl coming in through Canada. He also wants to get the trade more in balance. And so if countries can come up with some interesting, creative ideas, Trump is probably open to any proposals that can come forward, and maybe more non-traditional proposals than may have been the case previously. So I think we're going to see some significant negotiations with the different trading partners, and especially when you talk about Canada and Mexico and China, which are individual countries and can much more easily negotiate than the complications we just heard about with the many countries that are representing the EU.
But of course, how both Mexico and Canada, they are in a trade agreement, of course, formerly known as the NAFTA. So, I mean, can they, in what way they can basically navigate through this kind of situation? The purpose is to reduce, let's say, tariffs to have more freer trade among the three nations. But now we are facing a situation of extra tariff.
Yeah, well, Trump will try to suggest that there are, extreme problems that have come out of this, such as the flow of immigrants, such as the flow of fentanyl, and this allows him to be able to take these stances. Of course, if these things move forward, there's a high chance that the whole trade agreement, which is up for rediscussion among the parties in 2026, even if it moves, should run much further than that. So I think we're going to have, real significant discussions about the whole framework and if it should exist in the current way. But I think we may also have some legal challenges to what Trump can actually do, and what the U.S. can actually do, not only with this, but with many things that Trump is trying to do. But I think, all we can say is it's going to be an interesting time with lots of different options considered. And I do think that we're likely to see an increase in tariffs, despite the fact that I say, Trump is open to discussing. Trump is very clear. He loves tariffs, and he's probably going to impose more tariffs. And the question is not really if he's going to impose tariffs, but on who and to what percent.
On that point, of course, we have this the World Economic Forum and IMF director basically warns of this tit-for-tat situation, basically a global trade war or a regional trade war that would obviously destabilize, if not reduce, the overall trade volume globally. So, Susanna, do you see that kind of situation? Global trade will be destabilized, and bilateral or trilateral trade will be reduced.
Yeah, well, just following with the idea of U.S. having a very specific agenda with Canada and Mexico, which is security, immigration, and trade. We have to remember that the U.S. has different agendas with different countries. So with the North American region, he has been very clear. With China, he has also been very clear. It's the trade balance and technology transfer. Well, technology with Europe as well. So it's clear that countries are tending more to protectionist measures within the current context, economic context. But the truth is, like the principles of the WTO, well, there's two sides here. Most of the economies in the world belong to the WTO, so therefore they are obliged, or when they join the WTO, there's like a common understanding of what are their responsibilities while being part of the WTO, or if they not comply, of course, there's many mechanisms within the WTO to solve these differences. But also many economies in the world are also part of regional free trade agreements, such as RCEP, CPTPP, etc. So raising tariffs here and there to create chaos in the world trade system is not I don't see the whole multilateral economic system is going to collapse. No, definitely not. But we have to be prepared, as mentioned before. Trump likes tariffs. He's going to impose some. The question as well is to whom, how, and when. And other countries will have to raise tariffs as well in order to protect or to use them as leverage for these negotiations.
Yeah, Susanna, you have been based in Hong Kong for about 20 years. You are familiar with obviously the Great Bay Area situation, China, U.S. How do you look at the China options in terms of dealing with possible tariffs from Trump?
I think the tariffs are going to come. China is in a very different position that when China joined the WTO in 2001. The reality is that I don't see we're going to have a 100% made in North America product in the near future. The reality is that the North American manufacturer in Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. manufacturer still depends in large part from the inputs from China. So the reality is that it's not going to happen really soon that China and North America region are going to split or separate. I will say what Chinese I would say, at least for my experience working with Chinese companies investing in Mexico, I will advise just caution for Chinese companies investing in abroad and focus on compliance, because compliance is the only, at least in Mexico and Canada, the governments are trying to use compliance, like they're really enforcing the rules of the free trade agreements as a way to negotiate with the U.S. So that will be the only way. So governments that are affected by Trump's policies are going to use compliance and making sure that companies follow up the rules as a way to negotiate with the U.S. So I think for Chinese companies doing business abroad, that will be the best advice, to try to find the places where they can invest with the less risk and also follow up compliance, which is like a challenge for Chinese companies going abroad now.
Well, on the business community, of course, Trump's message is clear. Daniel, at the speech at the Davos Forum, he talked about, here's a quote, my message to every business in the world is very simple. Come make your product in America, and we will give you among the lowest taxes of any nation on earth. But if you don't make your product in America, then very simply, you have to pay a tariff. So what's the message? It seems very clear. Is he looking at the reindustrialization in America?
Yes, that is what he might be hoping for, but that's not the way to achieve it. Because, of course, now the American economy is booming, but basically in the tech sector. It is not booming in industry. Industry is stagnating in the US in manufacturing. And I think many people will be very careful about investing in the US because they see that the regulatory and political environment in the United States is no longer stable. One president comes, puts tariffs, the next one might be the opposite. One favors foreign investment, the next one says, no, I want American companies. So I'm very skeptical that actually that will achieve anything. Of course, he says so because it sounds so simple, so attractive to his American voters, but the reality is very different.
Carl, how do you look at that? He's basically, you can say, enticing or pressuring or threatening other businesses to invest in America. It is the time to invest in America and for the U.S. to achieve the goal of reindustrialization?
Well, there are certainly areas that one can benefit from investing in the U.S. in, such as the high-tech areas. Probably not across the board in all industries. And so clearly with the current situation with the U.S. likely to put increasing tariffs, this probably will increase incentives for companies from different countries around the world to start more manufacturing in the U.S. Honestly, I think it's particularly problematic that the U.S. wants to, raise tariffs on Mexico, because the combination of especially Mexico and the U.S. together, where you have a lower cost labor source in Mexico, is much more competitive. The U.S. is just not going to get down to labor costs at the level of Mexico. So I really hope the Trump administration is going to use the discussions with Mexico more as a threat to have really tight border control and get fentanyl coming into the U.S. under control, and then keep a free trade situation going on. But I would like to turn to one other thing you mentioned, and that's about China. I think actually China has some greater opportunities to discuss with the U.S. than some countries because there are a lot of different interactions between them. And China has actually been doing a number of things that the US likes, and there's potential to do more of that. However, China is extremely poorly understood in the US. The average person in the US just does not understand how China has evolved. It has a picture of China of about 15 years ago. So as one example, China has been doing a lot in the last decade to increasingly respect intellectual property. Intellectual property infringement is ironically the number one thing that US companies criticize China for, and the average US person thinks is happening in China. There are still some problems about this in China. But if you look at the direction of improvement, it is huge. So one big piece of advice I would give to China is to do even more to advertise the changes that have taken place and the things that have happened. I'm not a big Trump fan, but there's one thing we can learn from Trump. That is, keep messages simple and communicate many, many times. He is a fantastic communicator, and that's one of the reasons that he has done a good job. Probably China could learn some things from his playbook on communication.
Yeah, Carl, you mentioned that. What about, at one point of time, he mentioned about welcoming Chinese investment in this EVs to produce in the U.S. Do you think there's any degree of likelihood for the Chinese investors to manufacture EVs inside of the U.S.?
I think there's probably some possibility for that to happen. I mean, I think the importing of EVs is not looking very bright. So, if one could have some more production and maybe even some more R&D going on as well, this is the type of thing that might be possible. Of course, the risks that concern probably a Chinese company is, will policy change to make this not possible? One of the things that has been really unfortunate in recent years is a number of Chinese companies making major investments, for example, like in high-speed train manufacturing in the US, only to be later told this is a strategically important industry. And so, now you really can't continue to sell many projects in that area. So I think the US government needs to take a serious think about trying to have a little bit more of a long-term commitment to companies that come in and make major manufacturing decisions, or people are going to be wary of doing that.
Mm-hmm. Well, Susanna, of course, related to the relationship with Mexico, President Trump also proposed the changes of the name of Gulf of Mexico into Gulf of America. And then, how much impact is there?
Honestly, this was a joke for Mexican people. The truth is, as mentioned before, Trump speaks in two levels. One is for his voters, just to make sure people, just for popularity, just this kind of simple messages talking about Gulf of Mexico, changing to Gulf of America. The reality is, this kind of ideas are quite difficult to implement. Like, even if he passes this policy of changing the name to Gulf of America, is he going to force the rest of the world to change their maps from Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America? But we will hear, I think, during this second Trump period, we're going to hear a lot of these kind of policy crazy ideas happening. There's going to be a lot of noise created by Trump. And therefore, I think it's important for countries to continue focusing on the topics that really matter. No, on tariffs, on trade, on immigration, on security, and all these agendas that each country have with the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
Can I mention something here?
Yeah, go ahead, Kyle.
I think Mexico's president had a nice response to Trump. And that response was, okay, maybe, but we should rename North America Mexican-American, because that is actually the name that was mentioned some years ago. And, maybe one could push back and also say, actually, well, if we're going to change the name, let's, call it maybe the Florida Sea or the Gulf of New Spain, which are also two previous names that were given. But I would like to point out that he has actually signed an executive order, and it's moving forward.
Yes.
And there are real mechanisms to have the names change in the U.S. And so this is moving forward in the U.S. The issue is, can you persuade countries all around the world to change this name? I guess that may be difficult, although maybe some countries or many countries will do this to please Trump. Countries tend to be very sensitive to things like this and names like this and name changes. Name changes are historically very, very difficult. But honestly, I think we should put much more focus on trade barriers and issues like this that are having, let's say, real implications for the world.
Right. Daniel, of course, he used to talk about solving this Ukraine war issue in 24 hours. He said he needs more time later on, and he's urging European countries or NATO members to increase their defense spending up to 5%, rather than the 2% that we used to talk about. So, what do you make of that?
If the Europeans were to spend 5% of their GDP on defense, then I think the Ukraine war would be over very quickly, because Ukraine would win. Unfortunately, that's very unlikely to happen, because the Europeans are just not willing to spend a lot more, but they have understood. The political elites have understood that they have to go up. Maybe they can do a compromise, 3 to 3.5% in the long run. That seems to be possible, not now, but in 5 years, because the threat from Russia remains. So, as usual, Trump, when he says something outrageous like this, there's a kernel of truth, a small truth in there, which is that Europe should spend more, but actually the direction of travel is really the right one. And I think, again, on this point, one can reach a compromise.
Mm-hmm. He also talked about, basically the oil price. He urged Saudi Arabia and OPEC members to lower the prices of oil and gas. Here's of course, he's sort of relating that to the Ukraine war. He said, if the price came down, the Russia-Ukraine war would end immediately. Is that the case, Daniel?
It would end very quickly, because Russia depends on having high oil prices to fuel its export and therefore war machine. But it's very unlikely that the oil price will go down, because the American oil producers, they don't think politics, they think commercial. They want to make profits, and their costs are pretty high. So for them, it would be a disaster if the oil price went down. Because they just cannot compete a shale oil with Saudi Arabia, which has basically zero costs. So Trump might dream of lower oil prices, but that's very unlikely to happen, because after all, oil is big business, and big business in the US doesn't want to lose big money.
Mm-hmm. Daniel, very briefly, like 1 minute to go. If you look at Trump's impact, his second term, on the relationship between, say, Europeans' relationship with China, do you see, this triangle, in what direction it's moving?
I think it is moving and becoming more of a triangle, because under Biden, the assumption was the EU would just stick to the US and do everything the US does. Now, with Trump doing all sorts of strange things, I think the EU will become less dependent on the US, and there will be more of a equilateral triangle.
But that include, say, militarily as well as economically?
No, the EU has very little interest in military affairs in Asia. It will be mostly about economics and mostly about the fear of cheap Chinese good in Europe, but that can be contained. And I think there the EU is also again treating very slowly, as we can see in the story about the battery electric vehicles.
Yeah, changes in the European continent. Well, on that note, we are concluding today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.